Aelred's treatise on the miracles of the saints of Hexham is thought to have originated as a homily for the Augustinian canons in the Church of St. Andrew in Hexham, the church that had been Aelred's boyhood home, where his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather had been priests. The thought is that probably Aelred was asked to preach at the celebration of the translation of the 5 ancient bishops of the church for the translation of their relics. But we don't know. We don't know for sure about the date. We don't know for sure about the occasion. But we tend to say it was written in March of 1155, or the sermon was preached in March of 1155, and then he extended it. The work is not actually quite complete. It drops off suddenly, and I'll show you that. But it was an occasion for Aelred to go home to preach in his boyhood church, to tell stories, in fact, about his own family, although he doesn't identify them that way. The 5 ancient bishops of Hexham were Eata, Acca, Alcmund, Frethbert, and Tilbert. Aelred mostly only says things about Eata and Alcmund. The others were as little known to him as they are to us. And in fact, the beginning of the work doesn't deal with the early bishops at all. There is, by the way, in the Church of Hexham today, in St. Andrew's Church, there's a large paneled wall with paintings of the early bishops of the church. Also, in the transept, I think, of the church, there is a small plaque which lists the canons of Hexham and so on, and it includes, as a list of 3 priests, Aelred's great-grandfather, grandfather, and father. In fact, there's no memorial of Aelred in that church. And when I spoke to the verger there some years ago, he had no idea that Aelred of Rievaulx had anything to do with his church. But there is a memorial of the 5 ancient bishops, and there is a memorial of Aelred's father, grandfather, and great-grandfather. In his sermon and then the treatise, Aelred pays special attention to the history of the town and of its saints, and he tells stories that sound like stories he must have heard as a boy. He says about the church that it was founded under the very earliest kings, and it has long been resplendent with the dignity of the seat of a bishop. He's proud to be from Hexham, and he's proud with his memories of that place. It's an unusual hagiographical work because it's not devoted to just one saint, and in fact, he spends quite a lot of time talking about saints other than the ones that he's theoretically there to celebrate. Early in the work, he talks several times about St. Cuthbert and St. Wilfrid, more recent bishops of the area, as well as then later telling stories about the 5 bishops. He includes 5 somewhat jumbled stories of the translations of the relics. He will start to tell one story and then he'll say, well, at that time they found some boxes of the relics and they put them behind the altar. Or, by the way, Edric at this point healed a blind woman with one of the relics. So it's sort of a jumble to figure out what happened when and who was involved. His stories of the translations, though, and of what happened during the translations tend to overshadow the actual miracles that he says were carried out by these early bishops. It seems likely that the canons are with some of these stories and may have been particularly amused to hear Aelred tell slightly unfavorable stories about his relatives, especially because there was an awkward relationship between Aelred's family and the canons. When the Archbishop of York had decided to replace Aelred's family as priests of the church with Augustinian canons, Aelred's father had not been happy about it and had held on to as much of the possessions of the church as he could. So there are stories that when the canons first came here, to the Church of St. Andrews, they were pretty poor because Aelred's father had held on to all the money-making aspects of the church that he could. So the idea that they brought Aelred back to preach, and that Aelred includes stories of his own family behaving, shall we say, a little badly, must have amused the canons. And even though Aelred doesn't mention them as his family, I bet the canons knew. So early in the work, Aelred tells his listeners how to understand the stories he's about to tell, and how the stories of things that happened in the past apply to them today. And he includes himself in the picture. When we hear, dearest brothers, that by their prayers the saints restored lost light to the blind, if perhaps a cloud of foolishness has darkened the eyes of our mind, let us fly to them fearlessly for help. Then, with their holy merits revealed and our blindness removed, we may drink in the true light of wisdom. Thus, when our spiritual enemies attack us, pelting the wall of virtue with the missiles of temptation, brandishing the fear of endless death, we may know how to destroy them, recalling how powerfully they once snatched a helpless people besieged in this church out of the hand of those more powerful, and rescued the poor and needy from their despoilers, and how that spiritual attack will be relieved if only we cry out to them in a spirit of humility and with a contrite heart. If we are driven to vice by stings of the flesh or goads of anger, no despair will mute the voice of devout prayer. We know that, once called upon, the same loving kindness that seized a man condemned to death out of the hand of his attacker will also seize us, who are already engulfed in sin, if we approach with tears and prayers. Often in this work, as in the life of Ninian, it is the most humble who benefit most from the saint's power. In one case, a youth who is condemned to death and who has no one to pay what he has stolen, prays to our common refuge, Aelred says, namely St. Wilfrid, and to the other patron saints of the church. As the executioner prepares to strike the boy down, the boy cries out, "Help me now, Wilfrid, because if you don't now, soon you won't be able to." The place is filled with laughter as he says this, and suddenly, as the executioner holds back on his stroke because of the laughter, two young men, Wilfrid and Cuthbert, we believe, carried on swift horses, flew up rapidly. How often do you hear of saints on horses? Presenting surety, they snatched the youth away from death, freed him from his chains, and allowed him to go away free. The moral Aelred draws here is trust in God and his saints, which will bring aid in all necessities. And he connects this miracle to himself and to the people to whom he's preaching. If we should be bound by the chains of any wicked habit, let us beg the help of these saints with our eyes raised to heaven and our tears falling freely. We know that they will pick up arms and shields and arise to help us. But the historical event and its place in local memory at once recur as Aelred, perhaps speaking as the boy in the town he once was. He concludes nostalgically, "This miracle became known to so many that the youth's words, proven effective in such a great extremity, became a common saying among all the people." Perhaps because Aelred's family had a particular devotion to St. Cuthbert, he and Wilfrid occur later in another miracle, again riding in from a distance when the town is in danger. When Malcolm III of Scotland, the father of King David, attacked Hexham at one point, Aelred writes that the people fled for protection to the church. Some, he says, called out with groans and outcries to Wilfrid, others to Cuthbert, some to Acca, and not a few to Alkmund. During the night, in a vision, while the people are in the church, The priest of the church sees two bishops on horseback approaching the church from the south. Dismounting and leaving their horses in the priest's care, they go to the church to pray, and then on their return promise to save the town by extending a net from the source of the River Tyne to its mouth. When the priest, confused by this, asks who they are and what they're talking about this net, the leader of the parish says, "I am called Wilfrid, and see, here with me is St. Cuthbert. I brought him with me as I passed by Durham, so that we might at the same time come to our brothers who rest in this church and preserve the place and its people." And indeed, at dawn, a kind of cloud arose out of the west and covered the river, swallowing up the Scottish soldiers. A sudden flood kept Malcolm there for 3 days more, until at last, coming to himself, he said, "What are we doing? Let us withdraw from here, for these houses are holy." Since the event that Aelred is preaching at has nothing to do with Cuthbert and Wilfrid, though, pretty soon Aelred moves on to the second and longer part of the work about the bishops and the 5 translations that have already taken place. Translations being used here in a very casual sense. It appears that often someone would say, "Oh, there's some bones in this box, let's put them over here." But 5 occasions on which the bones have been moved somewhere in the church. The problem is the bones are not self-identifying. We know, for example, that the bones of Bernard and Malachi are kept mixed together, but we don't know which ones are Bernard's and which ones are Malachi's. You have bones and they don't generally have labels on them. So when the canons have translated or have moved these bones, it's not entirely clear who they belong to. They would like to believe that they are their own bishops, but there's no proof of it. So Aelred is stuck with the task of saying, how do we know that these are the same bishops kept in the same church all this time? Part of the problem is that in this period, a church that didn't have any relics often would steal relics from some other church, because after all, it's a money-making task. If you have relics in your church, then people will come see them, and they will pay something for the privilege of seeing them, or they will shop in the gift shop or the tea shop. I don't know how they handled that in the 12th century, but they certainly made money off relics. So there was a lot of process of people stealing relics from one church and taking it to another. And very often this was explained as being done at the request of the saint in question, because the saint in question felt that he'd been overlooked. He hadn't been treated well. His shrine wasn't good enough. Nobody honored him. There wasn't a label in front of his shrine. And so the story was that the saint had said, I would like to go someplace else now. And, of course, what is the church to do but to send people off to get him? Aelred is faced with a different problem. He wants to say, not that the saints have been moved from someplace else at their choice, but that, in fact, they have stayed in the same place through these years. And the most likely person who might have taken these bones someplace else that he needs to argue against is his great-grandfather, Alfred, son of Westhu. He was a member of the cathedral chapter at Durham, but he was an inveterate relic collector. He traveled around. I picture this old man, sort of John the Baptist in the north of England, traveling around, picking up relics wherever he could. The place has been despoiled by Vikings and then later by Normans. There are a lot of loose bones around, and Alfred is happy to take them back to Durham and enshrine them properly and make sure they get the respect that they should. So it seems likely that Ogmund might have taken some of these bones. So how do we know whose the bones are? So Aelred tells a series of stories that explain how we know. And how we know is that the saints have repeatedly refused to be moved. And they've refused to be moved by Aelred's ancestors. So, he explains that in one case, when his grandfather, Alfred, showed up to take the bones of Bishop Acca to Durham, he was mysteriously barred from doing so. He says, prompted by divine revelation, as he passed through the sacred places laid waste by the savagery of the barbarians, he took the relics of many saints from their burial places and transferred them to the church in Durham. He came to the Holy Church of Hexham and took up the relics of Saint Acca. But foreseeing what sacredness and honor this church was to have, he was unwilling or unable to take away these sacred relics. He concealed them decently inside the church, taking thought for veneration of places, the devotion of people of his time, and the improvement of those to come, as divine grace affected him. He then tells of 4 further occasions in which the bones of the various bishops were moved to different places, including the appearance in person or of one or another of the bishops to resist attempts to move them elsewhere, because they insisted on remaining at peace at home in Hexham. So, for example, in another story involving Alfred, his great-grandfather, Bishop Auckland appeared in the middle of the night in a vision to the curate of the church. At that point, Alfred was still a cathedral canon in Durham, but he had responsibility for the church and had a curate there. So Bishop Auckland appeared in the middle of the night in full vestments. It's important for the saints to identify themselves. If they just came in their shroud, no one would know who they were. But if they came in full vestments, then it's pretty clear that they're a bishop. And, in fact, he identifies himself. And he says to the curate, I would like to have my bones moved to a higher place where they will receive more honor. So the curate the next day reported this vision to Alfred. And so Alfred called together people who could dig up the place where they thought Alckman was probably buried. You can see why Alckman thought he deserved more honor, because they didn't even know for sure where he was. So they dug, and they dug, and they dug. And pretty soon it was sexed, and then it was known, and then it was getting on toward evening, and they just weren't finding any bones. And there was quite a lot of laughter about these priests who believe in dreams and go digging up the churchyard because of a dream they've had. But eventually, late in the afternoon, they find the bones of Alckman. They dig them up, and they decide that, of course, they want a solemn mass for the translation. They will put him in a new shrine, a new box or something. And it's too late in the day to do that. So everybody goes away for the night, and Alfred puts the bones of Alckman in the south porch of the church, discreetly covered. And then he goes away to bed. But he thought it was a shame for all those bones to stay in Hexham, because after all, it would be quite good to have a few bones of Alckman off in Durham, wouldn't it? And so he went and he took just one small finger of Alckman and put it away privately so that the next day he could take it back with him to Durham. But the next day, when everyone came and attempted to gather up the coffin with Alckman's bones, they couldn't lift it. It was too heavy. They couldn't lift it off the ground. They'd been able to the day before, but this day they can't lift it. They tried for quite a long time, and eventually the first crowd was replaced with another group of people who came to lift the coffin, and they could not. All day long they tried to lift the coffin with Alckman's bones, and they couldn't do it. So night came, everyone went to bed again. And that night, Alckman appeared again to the same curate, and he said, "What is it that you want to do? Am I to be carried to the church bereft of my members, to stand mutilated before the blessed apostle Andrew and his sacred altar, which I served for so many years with my whole body and mind?" And showing him his hand, from which half of one finger appeared to have been cut off, he said, Get up and bear witness to the people that the one who took away my finger should restore it. Then my members may rest in their place of repose in their integrity, and those who have come together with such devotion to honor me may obtain the desired fruit of their labor." So the next day the curate reported to the people what had happened and said, whoever took this bone should explain it now. Alfred, we are told, rejoiced at the miracle that had found him out, and he explained to the people why he had taken the finger, and he replaced it, and it was then easy to lift the coffin and to proceed with the translation. 2 generations later, when Aelred's father was priest of the church, he decided again to move the relics to a better place. It's hard if you don't have a proper shrine to know where to put boxes of bones, and so they kept rearranging them. And so he decided he would put them behind the high altar. So after disinterring the relics again, he placed them in the south porch in the care of his younger brother Aelred. But Aelred, considering that one small church should not have so many relics, approached the box with the intention of taking a bone or two. But each time he approached, he was met with such burning heat that he was not able even to touch, let alone to remove any of the bones. Finally, between 1112 and 1114, so during Aelred's childhood, the canons of York Cathedral decided to seize the bones of St. Eata. Everyone really thought that Hexham was too trivial a church to have all these bones. So, canons of the church came with Archbishop Thomas, and they declared that they were there to take the bones of St. Eata. And although the people of Hexham pled with them and wept, they could not be deterred. Finally, the night before they were to return to York with the bones, when the bishop had retired to his bed for quiet and sleep, he saw in a dream a man standing beside him wearing episcopal insignia, grave in aspect and emitting a tremendous light. The bishop quailed, scarcely enduring the terror that spread before his eyes and face. Trembling, he awaited what the man would do. That one, looking wrathfully at him as he looked back, said this to him: "Why does it suit you to disturb my quiet and to remove me from the place where I sleep and rest with my brothers to other peoples? This is not the Lord's will, but your own presumption, for which you will now pay the penalty." Raising the pastoral staff that he held in his hand, he struck Thomas's shoulder twice, and with many threats he disappeared. Terrified by the blow, Thomas awoke with a shout. At this, the clerics who were with him rose and came to him. Finding him trembling and pale, they entreated him to reveal the cause. He reported the vision, and in the morning, calling the brothers to him, he confessed his guilt and asked forgiveness, promising that he would never again attempt anything of this kind. He requested they offer a sacrifice of prayers for him. The brothers were much gladdened by this behavior, and the clerics, frustrated with their hope, were not a little perplexed. For 3 days, Thomas suffered from the saint's blow. On the 4th day, he was at last healed by the one who had struck him. The infirmity left him, and he left the town. Aelred ends the work here without asking for prayers, as he usually does, and without tying the work up neatly. Perhaps he had more stories that he wanted to add, or perhaps he was simply interrupted and never got back to it. But I like to think of him as sharing what may have been family stories that would have been told over and over to him as a boy in Hexham, and sharing them with the canons and having a chance to relive them in the place where they had taken place. Even in its unfinished state, this work testifies to Aelred's power as a storyteller and a worthy successor to his ancestors and the citizens of his town. Those are the kind of stories you tell at dinner parties, right?
Holy Queen,
Mother of mercy,
Amen.